Michael Torres. The blood was the first thing Officer Janet Riley noticed when she entered Michael Torres's bedroom at 7:23 a.m. on June 8, 1996. Dark crimson stains soaked into the beige carpet near the window, spatters decorated the wall above the headboard, and what appeared to be defensive wounds had left smears across the white paint of the doorframe. The violence suggested in that small room seemed impossible to reconcile with the graduation cap and gown hanging neatly in the closet, waiting for a ceremony that would begin in just 11 hours. Michael Torres should have been the proudest teenager in Burlington, Vermont that morning. As valedictorian of Burlington High School's class of 1996, he was scheduled to deliver the commencement address to 300 graduates and their families. His speech, found later on his desk computer, spoke eloquently about building bridges between what we've been and what will become. The irony would haunt investigators for decades. Michael's mother, Carmen Torres, had discovered the scene when she came to wake her son for their planned celebration breakfast. Carmen worked double shifts as a nurse at the University of Vermont Medical Center to support Michael's academic achievements, often leaving before dawn and returning after midnight. Miguel Torres, Michael's father, managed a small auto repair shop and had been planning to close early that Saturday to watch his son graduate, the first person in their family to complete high school, let alone earn a full scholarship to MIT. The Torres family had immigrated from El Salvador in 1979, fleeing civil war, with nothing but hopes for their infant son's future. They had scraped together every dollar for Michael's education, declining social services and working jobs that paid cash to avoid drawing attention to their undocumented status. Michael's academic success represented not just personal achievement, but vindication of their sacrifices and proof that the American dream remained possible for those willing to work for it. Detective Susan Walsh arrived at the Torres home within an hour of the initial call. The scene immediately struck her as unusual. Despite the significant amount of blood, there was no body. Michael's wallet remained on his dresser, containing $87 he had been saving for college expenses. His car keys hung on their usual hook by the front door. Most puzzling, his packed suitcases sat by his bedroom door, ready for the family's planned celebration trip to Boston the following week. The blood evidence told a confusing story. Spatter patterns suggested a violent struggle, but the stains were concentrated in a relatively small area near the window. There were no drag marks leading out of the room, no obvious signs of how a body might have been removed. The window screen had been cut, providing a potential exit route, but the drop to the concrete patio below would have made carrying an unconscious person nearly impossible. Initial investigation focused on Michael's academic rivals and college competitors. As valedictorian, he had edged out several other high-achieving students for various scholarships and honors. Jennifer Walsh, the salutatorian, who would now be delivering the graduation speech, had been bitter about losing the top ranking due to a single B+ in AP chemistry. Her parents had hired attorneys to challenge the ranking, arguing that Michael's ESL status gave him unfair advantages in certain classes. Michael didn't deserve those scholarships, Jennifer had told friends just weeks before graduation. My family has been in Vermont for generations. We've paid taxes, supported this community. Why should some illegal immigrant get opportunities that belong to American kids? Detective Walsh, no relation to the suspect, also investigated David Morrison, a chemistry teacher who had been Michael's academic mentor and strongest advocate. Morrison had written recommendation letters for Michael's MIT application and had spent countless hours tutoring him without payment. Several students had noticed Morrison's intense personal interest in Michael's success, and a few parents had questioned whether the relationship was appropriate. The investigation took a darker turn when Walsh discovered that the Torres family was living under false documentation. Miguel and Carmen had been using Social Security numbers belonging to deceased individuals, filing tax returns, and working jobs under identities they had purchased from a document forger in the 1980s. The revelation added complexity to the case and made federal authorities take interest in what had initially been a local crime. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials suggested that Michael might have fled voluntarily upon learning that his family status was about to be exposed. Perhaps he had staged his own disappearance rather than face deportation and the collapse of his academic future. The theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that Michael had been researching identity fraud laws in the weeks before his disappearance, using library computers to avoid leaving traces on his home system. However, the blood evidence contradicted any voluntary disappearance theory. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Michael, and the volume suggested serious injury or death. Without a body or witness testimony, the case stalled within months. Jennifer Walsh's alibi proved solid. She had been volunteering at a church event the night Michael disappeared. Morrison's whereabouts were accounted for through multiple sources. Immigration officials conducted raids, but found no trace of Michael or evidence that he had fled the country. The Torres family's grief was compounded by suspicion from their community. Some neighbors whispered that the family had brought this tragedy upon themselves through their illegal status. Others suggested that Michael's disappearance was connected to gang activity or drug trafficking, assumptions based more on prejudice than evidence. Carmen and Miguel found themselves isolated, unable to seek support from authorities they didn't trust, and abandoned by a community that had never fully accepted them. Years passed with no resolution. Carmen Torres aged rapidly, her hair whitening and her health declining as she maintained hope that Michael would return. She kept his bedroom exactly as it had been found, cleaning around the bloodstains that crime scene technicians had documented but not removed. Miguel threw himself into work, expanding his auto repair business and earning citizenship through the Immigration Reform Act. But he never spoke publicly about his missing son. The case was reviewed periodically as detective rotations brought fresh eyes to old evidence. In 2003, DNA technology advances allowed for more sophisticated analysis of the blood evidence, but the results only confirmed what investigators already knew. In 2010, a new detective theorized that Michael might have been murdered by human traffickers who had discovered his family's false documents, but extensive investigation yielded no supporting evidence. In 2018, Detective James Park was assigned to Burlington's newly created Cold Case Unit. Park brought a different perspective to Michael's disappearance, focusing less on the immigration angle and more on the unusual aspects of the crime scene. The staged appearance of the bedroom, the convenient timing before graduation, and the family's sophisticated document fraud operation suggested a level of planning that seemed inconsistent with a random crime. Park's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing financial records from the 1990s, he discovered that the Torres family's document forger, a man named Carlos Mendoza, had been operating a much larger identity theft ring than originally suspected. Mendoza had been selling not just false documents to immigrants, but complete stolen identities to various criminal organizations. He had been murdered in 1997, ostensibly by rival criminals, but the case had never been solved. Further investigation revealed that Mendoza had been blackmailing some of his clients, threatening to expose their fraudulent documents unless they provided him with additional services. The Torres family's auto repair shop, with its cash business and immigrant clientele, would have been an ideal front for money laundering operations. Park theorized that Michael might have discovered his parents' involvement in criminal activity beyond simple document fraud. The theory gained support when Park uncovered evidence that Miguel Torres had been reporting suspicious cash transactions to federal authorities since 1995. The reports, filed under federal whistleblower protections, detailed a complex money laundering operation involving several local businesses and city officials. Miguel had apparently been cooperating with an FBI investigation while trying to protect his family from deportation. In 2024, Park received a call that would finally solve Michael Torres's disappearance. A man identifying himself as Robert Chen contacted the Burlington Police Department from Phoenix, Arizona, claiming to have information about the case. Chen said he had been following the investigation through online true crime forums and believed he might be able to help. The man who arrived at Burlington Police Headquarters 3 days later was 46 years old, carried identification showing he was Robert Chen, and bore only slight resemblance to the 18-year-old Michael Torres, who had vanished 28 years earlier. Plastic surgery had altered his facial features, weight gain had changed his build, and contact lenses had turned his brown eyes blue. But dental records and DNA testing confirmed the impossible. Robert Chen was Michael Torres. Michael's story, told over several days of interviews, revealed a conspiracy far more complex than anyone had imagined. In the weeks before graduation, Michael had discovered that his parents were not just using false documents for immigration purposes, but were serving as money launderers for a criminal organization led by City Councilman Richard Walsh, Jennifer Walsh's father, and several other prominent Burlington residents. The organization had been using immigrant-owned businesses to process drug money and illegal gambling proceeds. Families desperate to avoid deportation were coerced into participating, threatened with exposure to immigration authorities if they refused to cooperate. Miguel Torres had eventually agreed to provide information to federal authorities, but the criminals had discovered his cooperation. On the night before graduation, 2 men had come to the Torres home with orders to kill Michael as a message to his father. Miguel and Carmen were to be allowed to live, but only if they continued laundering money and never spoke about their son's murder. The plan was to make Michael's death look like a hate crime or random violence, deflecting attention from the criminal organization. Michael had been awakened by voices in his house and had hidden in his closet when the men entered his room. He had watched through the slats as they staged the crime scene, using pig's blood obtained from a local slaughterhouse to simulate a violent attack. The men had planned to return the following night to kill Michael and dispose of his body, but they wanted the family to suffer through the fake graduation ceremony first. Instead, Michael had escaped through his bedroom window and fled Vermont that same night. He had used money his father had hidden in the house, proceeds from the money laundering operation, to travel to California, where he had purchased a new identity from criminals connected to the organization his parents had been fighting. The irony was not lost on him. He had used dirty money to escape dirty money. For 28 years, Michael had lived as Robert Chen, working construction jobs and avoiding any activities that might require background checks. He had never married, never applied for credit, never did anything that might create records, linking him to his previous identity. He had watched from afar as his parents aged and grieved, wanting desperately to contact them but knowing that doing so would endanger their lives. The decision to come forward had been triggered by seeing his mother's obituary online. Carmen Torres had died in 2023, never knowing that her son was alive. Overwhelmed by guilt and grief, Michael had finally decided to risk everything to tell the truth about what had happened to his family. The revelation led to one of the largest corruption investigations in Vermont history. Richard Walsh and 6 other individuals were arrested on charges ranging from money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. Several had died in the intervening years, but extensive financial records confirmed the scope of their criminal enterprise. Miguel Torres, now 73 and suffering from emphysema, was able to see his son again before his own death 6 months later. The reunion was captured by local media, showing an elderly man embracing a middle-aged stranger who was simultaneously his lost child and a complete unknown. Michael Torres legally reclaimed his original identity in 2025, though he continues living in Arizona under circumstances far different from what anyone had imagined for the former valedictorian. His MIT scholarship is long expired, his graduation speech was never delivered, and the bridges he had written about building between past and future had been burned by forces beyond his control. The case highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant families to exploitation and the long-term consequences of crimes that extend beyond their immediate victims. Michael's survival came at the cost of his identity, his family relationships, and nearly 3 decades of living in fear. His story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating crimes are not the ones that kill, but the ones that force people to kill who they used to be in order to survive. The Torres family auto repair shop still operates in Burlington, now run by Miguel's nephew. A small memorial plaque near the entrance honors Carmen and Miguel Torres for their courage in pursuit of justice, though it makes no mention of their surviving son who lost his life without dying, disappeared without leaving, and spent 28 years being dead while remaining very much alive. The body was discovered at dawn on November 12, 1994, by a group of recreational hikers exploring the rugged terrain 20 miles northeast of Tucson. The remains lay in a shallow wash, partially concealed by creosote bushes and bleached by months of desert sun. What remained of the clothing suggested a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, though the harsh Arizona climate had made precise determination difficult. Detective Maria Santos of the Pima County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene by 8 a.m., already sweating through her blazer despite the November chill. The medical examiner estimated the body had been there between 6 and 8 months, placing the death sometime during the previous spring. Cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, though the desert scavengers had complicated the investigation considerably. The breakthrough came not from forensic evidence, but from a piece of jewelry that had somehow survived the elements. A delicate silver bracelet remained clasped around the victim's wrist, engraved with the words, "Sarah, love always, Mom and Dad," along with a graduation date from the previous year. Within hours, Detective Santos had connected the bracelet to Sarah Chen, a 21-year-old University of Arizona student who had been reported missing by her roommate in April. Sarah's parents, Dr. David Chen and his wife Linda, drove down from Phoenix within hours of receiving the call. The identification process was necessarily limited, given the condition of the remains, but the bracelet, the estimated age and size of the victim, and the location where Sarah was last seen all seemed to align. DNA testing was still expensive and time-consuming in 1994, typically reserved for cases with stronger evidence or viable suspects. "We knew something terrible had happened," Linda Chen would later tell reporters. "Sarah was so responsible. She would never just disappear without calling. When she didn't come home for Easter, we knew in our hearts that she was gone." The investigation into Sarah's murder followed familiar patterns. Detectives interviewed her professors, classmates, and co-workers at the campus bookstore, where she worked part-time. Sarah had been an engineering major, with a 3.8 GPA, described by everyone as studious, ambitious, and cautious. She had no known enemies, no dangerous habits, no boyfriend who might have posed a threat. The last confirmed sighting placed Sarah leaving the university library around 9 p.m. on April 3, 1994. Her car was found 3 days later in a shopping center parking lot 15 miles from campus, keys still in the ignition, purse and backpack untouched on the passenger seat. Security cameras from that era were limited, and none captured useful footage of who might have taken Sarah from that location. Detective Santos pursued several leads that ultimately led nowhere. A drifter who had been arrested for petty theft near the shopping center had a solid alibi. A teaching assistant who had been inappropriate with female students was cleared through multiple witnesses, placing him elsewhere that night. The investigation gradually lost momentum as other cases demanded attention. The Chen family held a funeral service in December 1994, 8 months after Sarah's disappearance. Nearly 300 people attended, including professors who spoke about Sarah's potential as an engineer and classmates who remembered her kindness and determination. Her parents established a scholarship fund in her name and became advocates for missing persons families throughout Arizona. Years passed. Dr. Chen retired early, never fully recovering from the loss of his only child. Linda Chen volunteered with victim services organizations, channeling her grief into helping other families navigate similar tragedies. They marked Sarah's birthday each year with a quiet dinner and donations to the scholarship fund that had grown to help dozens of students pursue engineering degrees. Detective Santos retired in 2010, but Sarah's case remained one of her most haunting failures. The file had been reviewed multiple times over the years, but without new evidence or witness testimony, there was little progress to be made. The case represented the cruel randomness of violence that kept law enforcement officers awake at night. In 2018, the Pima County Sheriff's Office received a federal grant to pursue genetic genealogy testing on cold cases with unidentified remains. Sarah Chen's case was not initially prioritized, since she had been identified and her murder investigated. However, a new detective reviewing old files noticed that the identification had been based primarily on circumstantial evidence rather than definitive scientific proof. Detective James Rodriguez decided to submit the DNA extracted from the 1994 remains for genealogy analysis, partly to confirm the identification and partly to see if genetic relatives might provide new leads about potential suspects. The results from Parabon Nanolabs arrived in March 2023, nearly 29 years after the body was discovered. The DNA did not match Sarah Chen. Instead, the genetic genealogy analysis identified the victim as Maria Elena Santos, a 23-year-old undocumented immigrant from Sonora, Mexico. Maria had crossed the border in early 1994, working in restaurant kitchens and cleaning services around Tucson. She had no legal documentation, no bank accounts, no official records of her existence in the United States. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the sheriff's office and the Chen family. Dr. Chen, now 78 and suffering from early-stage Alzheimer's, struggled to comprehend that they had been mourning over the wrong person's grave for nearly 3 decades. Linda Chen was devastated, but also filled with a desperate hope she hadn't felt in years. "If that's not Sarah in the cemetery," she told Detective Rodriguez, "then where is my daughter?" The investigation into the real Sarah Chen began immediately. Rodriguez discovered that someone had been using Sarah's Social Security number and identity documents since 1995. Tax records showed employment at various locations across the Southwest. Credit reports indicated a quiet but consistent financial life. Most remarkably, medical records from a 2019 emergency room visit in Albuquerque showed that Sarah Chen had been treated for a broken wrist. Rodriguez traveled to New Mexico and, working with local authorities, located the address associated with the most recent credit report activity. The woman who answered the door was Asian American, in her late 40s, with graying hair and cautious eyes. She identified herself as Sarah Chen. The real Sarah Chen had been living under her own name for 29 years, but in circumstances her parents never could have imagined. In April 1994, Sarah had witnessed the execution-style murder of 2 people behind a restaurant where she worked part-time. She had seen the faces of the killers and recognized one as a man connected to a drug trafficking organization that operated between Mexico and Arizona. Before she could decide whether to report the murders, men came to her apartment. They made it clear that she had 2 choices: disappear permanently or die. They provided her with enough cash to start over and warned that any contact with her family or law enforcement would result in their deaths as well as her own. Sarah had taken Maria Santos' identification documents, found among the belongings of one of the murder victims. Maria had apparently been in the wrong place at the wrong time, killed because she had also witnessed the murders. Sarah used Maria's identity to disappear, while someone else placed Maria's body in the desert wearing Sarah's bracelet. For 29 years, Sarah believed her parents thought she was dead and buried. She had no idea they had been mourning over Maria Santos's remains, or that Maria had a family in Mexico who had spent decades wondering what happened to their daughter. The reunion between Sarah and her parents in May 2023 was covered extensively by local media. Dr. Chen's Alzheimer's made the situation more complex as he struggled to understand why his daughter looked so much older than he remembered. Linda Chen, now 69, described the experience as impossible happiness mixed with unbearable guilt. The investigation into Maria Santos' murder and the drug trafficking organization responsible has been reopened, though most of the original perpetrators are likely dead or imprisoned on other charges. Sarah has provided extensive testimony about what she witnessed in 1994, finally able to speak the truth after nearly 3 decades of forced silence. Maria Santos was reburied in Tucson with her correct name on the headstone. Her family in Mexico, located through genetic genealogy, traveled to Arizona for the service. They had never stopped searching for Maria, never stopped hoping she was alive somewhere in America, working and saving money to return home. The Chen Family Scholarship Fund was renamed to honor both Sarah Chen and Maria Santos, supporting students from both sides of the border who pursue engineering degrees. Sarah, who spent decades working menial jobs under an assumed identity, has enrolled in college to finally complete the engineering degree that was interrupted by violence 29 years ago. Detective Rodriguez continues investigating similar cases, where identification may have been based on limited evidence, wondering how many other families might be mourning the wrong person, while their actual loved ones remain missing, living or dead, somewhere in the vast expanse of the American Southwest. The Memory Thief. The screams started at 3:47 a.m. on June 18, 1983, when Helen Crawford discovered that her twin daughters' beds were empty. 8-year-old Amy and Beth had been sleeping in their shared bedroom at the back of the modest ranch house in Bakersfield, California. Their windows cracked open to combat the oppressive Central Valley heat. By dawn, every neighbor on Maple Street was awake, drawn outside by Helen's hysteria and the growing chorus of police sirens. Detective Frank Morrison arrived as the sun painted the surrounding almond orchards in shades of gold and amber. The Crawford house sat at the end of a dead-end street, backing up to undeveloped farmland that stretched for miles. The girls' bedroom window screen had been carefully removed and placed against the exterior wall. No other signs of forced entry were evident, and nothing else in the house had been disturbed. Amy and Beth Crawford were identical twins, indistinguishable except for a small scar on Amy's left knee from a bicycle accident the previous summer. They wore matching yellow pajamas to bed that night and had spent the evening watching television with their parents before being tucked in at 9 p.m. Their father, Robert Crawford, worked the night shift at a nearby oil refinery and had left for work at 11 p.m., kissing both girls goodnight before departing. The initial search involved over 100 volunteers, including National Guard units and search dogs from 3 counties. The girls' scent trail led from their bedroom window across the backyard and into the orchards, but disappeared completely at a dirt access road used by farm equipment. Tire impressions in the soft earth suggested a large vehicle, possibly a truck or van, though the tracks were too degraded to provide specific identification. Within 48 hours, attention focused on a drifter named Marcus Webb, who had been seen in the area during the previous week. Webb, a 43-year-old ex-convict with a history of burglary and assault, had been sleeping rough in the orchards and begging for work at local farms. Several residents reported seeing him watching children at the neighborhood playground, though no one had thought to call police at the time. Webb was arrested at a homeless camp near the Kern River, but he vehemently denied any involvement in the twins' disappearance. He claimed to have been drinking with other transients the night of June 18th, though his alleged companions had already scattered. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime, prosecutors could only hold him on outstanding warrants from other jurisdictions. The breakthrough came 12 days after the disappearance. A rancher checking irrigation equipment found Amy Crawford's body in a concrete culvert 3 miles from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her yellow pajamas torn and stained with dirt and blood. The discovery devastated the search volunteers and confirmed everyone's worst fears about Beth's fate. Marcus Webb was immediately charged with Amy's murder. The circumstantial case was strong. His presence in the area, his criminal history, and the lack of other viable suspects. Webb continued protesting his innocence, but his court-appointed attorney advised him to accept a plea deal rather than risk the death penalty. In November 1983, Webb pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Beth Crawford remained missing. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, no trace of her was ever found. Detective Morrison theorized that Webb had disposed of her body in a different location, perhaps deeper in the agricultural areas where it might never be discovered. The case file remained open, but active investigation gradually ceased as other crimes demanded attention. Helen Crawford never recovered from the loss of her daughters. She suffered a complete nervous breakdown and spent months in psychiatric care. Robert Crawford threw himself into work, picking up extra shifts to pay mounting medical bills and to avoid being home in the silent house. The couple divorced in 1985, each unable to bear the constant reminder of their shared tragedy. The yellow bedroom where Amy and Beth had slept remained unchanged for years, their beds still made, their toys and clothes undisturbed. Helen would sit in that room for hours, talking to her missing daughter, as though Beth might still come home. Neighbors whispered about the woman who had lost her mind, along with her children. Marcus Webb died in prison in 1997, maintaining his innocence until the end. His death closed the only official lead in Beth Crawford's disappearance, though Helen continued to receive occasional calls from psychics and amateur investigators claiming to have information about her surviving daughter. In 2018, the Kern County Sheriff's Office created a cold case unit funded by state grants to address decades of unsolved crimes. Detective Sarah Martinez was assigned to review the Crawford case, primarily to determine if advancing DNA technology might provide new leads or confirm Webb's guilt in Amy's murder. Martinez discovered that biological evidence from Amy's assault had been properly preserved, but DNA testing in 1983 was not available. Initial analysis confirmed that Webb was not the source of the foreign DNA found on Amy's clothing and body. The revelation was stunning. Marcus Webb had been innocent, and Amy's real killer had never been identified. The DNA was submitted to CODIS, the National Criminal Database, and to Genetic Genealogy Services. Within months, the profile was linked to Gerald Hoffman, a long-haul truck driver who had died in a traffic accident in 1991. Hoffman's employment records showed he had been making deliveries throughout California's Central Valley in the spring and summer of 1983. Further investigation revealed that Hoffman had been suspected but never charged in several child abductions across the western United States during the 1980s. He typically targeted isolated rural homes and took children in pairs, though previous cases had always resulted in the recovery of bodies within days of the abductions. Beth Crawford's case was different. No trace of her had ever been found, leading Martinez to wonder if Hoffman might have kept her alive for some reason. The detective began searching for unidentified women who might match Beth's description, focusing on Jane Doe cases from the late 1980s onward. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In January 2023, Martinez received a call from the Albuquerque Police Department. A woman named Jennifer Walsh had been arrested for shoplifting and had provided inconsistent information about her identity and background. During questioning, she had mentioned being from California and had specific knowledge about the Crawford case that wasn't public information. Martinez traveled to New Mexico and interviewed the woman, who appeared to be in her late 40s, with brown hair and haunted eyes. Jennifer Walsh claimed to have no memory of her life before age 15 and had been living under various assumed names for decades. She was homeless, suffered from severe anxiety and dissociative episodes, and had a history of petty crimes and drug use. Physical examination revealed old scars consistent with childhood abuse, including marks that suggested prolonged restraint. Most significantly, she had a small scar on her left knee that matched the injury Beth Crawford had sustained in a bicycle accident just before her disappearance. DNA testing confirmed what Martinez had begun to suspect. Jennifer Walsh was Beth Crawford. She had survived her abduction and had been living under assumed identities for nearly 40 years, her memory fractured by trauma and years of psychological manipulation. Through careful interviews with trauma specialists, fragments of Beth's story emerged. Gerald Hoffman had kept her captive for 18 years, moving frequently between locations across the Southwest. He had convinced her that her parents were dead, that police were looking for her as a criminal, and that he was the only person protecting her from a hostile world. When Hoffman died in the 1991 traffic accident, Beth was 26 years old and had been so thoroughly conditioned that she didn't know how to seek help. She had no identification, no understanding of how to navigate normal society, and was terrified of authority figures. She survived through petty crime and temporary relationships, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections. Beth had retained some memories of her childhood, but had been convinced they were dreams or fantasies. She remembered a sister who looked like her, a yellow bedroom, and a mother who cried a lot. But Hoffman had dismissed these as products of her imagination. Only when she saw news coverage of cold case investigations did she begin to wonder if her dreams might be real memories. The reunion between Beth and her surviving family was complicated by decades of trauma and separation. Helen Crawford, now 78 and living in assisted care, initially couldn't process that the damaged woman before her was her lost daughter. Beth struggled with the reality that her mother was elderly and frail, nothing like the young woman she remembered. Robert Crawford had remarried and moved to Oregon, where he had built a new life with stepchildren who knew nothing about his tragic past. The discovery that Beth was alive forced him to confront grief he had buried for 40 years. Beth's recovery has been slow and difficult. She suffers from complex PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, and has difficulty forming trusting relationships. She lives in a supervised facility and receives extensive therapy. slowly rebuilding an identity that was stolen from her as a child. The case led to the posthumous exoneration of Marcus Webb, though his family had long since given up fighting for his reputation. Gerald Hoffman was linked through DNA and circumstantial evidence to at least 6 other child murders across 4 states, cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Detective Martinez continues working with Beth to recover more memories that might help solve additional cases. Each session reveals new fragments of her stolen childhood and the 18 years she spent in captivity, pieces of a puzzle that illustrates the devastating long-term impact of crimes that extend far beyond the initial act of violence. Beth Crawford's survival represents both a miracle and a tragedy. A life that was saved but forever altered by a predator who understood that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to a child is not to kill them, but to erase who they used to be.